Okay, thank you. If I wander away from these, please let me know. Thank you all for showing up for the last session of this, the first day of LAD. So it's a good thing you're here. This is going to be the most important talk that you hear perhaps ever. Certainly today, certainly this weekend, perhaps this year. And here's why. We're going to talk to you about the Lustre test suites. This is the thing that keeps us safe at night, right? These are the tests that talk about, that prove that Lustre is still stable, still correct, still functioning like we all depend it to be on. So we're going to go through and talk about the basics of Lustre testing. Please read this when you get the slides in depth. This one also. So we're going to start out very broad and talk about our motivations, our goals for giving this talk, and hopefully persuade you that you should care about the Lustre test suites, why you should care, who should care, explain to you that they're still relevant. Then we're going to get very specific. Justin's going to take you through several examples of how to run the tests, configuration files, and what to do in case of error. So let's see. Okay, so motivation. So perhaps you remember Christopher this morning gave the slide presentation on Lustre 2.8, the stats, right? Number of people, number of institutions that have participated and submitted patches. And he said, you know, the call to arms is we need more people reviewing the patches. Now, I'm not going to argue with that at all, but the thing that is rarely talked about at these conferences, talks, and various other places in bars and hotel rooms all across the nation is testing. That we need more people testing Lustre. We need more people adding to the tests that are there. So why should you care? So, well, I'll get to why you should care. It's obvious, but I'll have to spell it a little bit. One of the best things about Lustre tests is there's a low barrier to entry, right? If you want to contribute to Lustre, it's I don't know, maybe all of you are developers that have doing this from day one, but for somebody who's not been doing working on Lustre, is not a kernel developer, there's a high bar to entry, a high barrier to entry. And with the testing, that's not exactly true. The testing is something that everybody can do. Running tests, anybody can do, and contributing and expanding the tests, we can all do. So what we hope to do in this talk is to give some very practical examples of how to run the tests, and so that you can take them home. And maybe you're not interested in testing Lustre, and that's fine, but maybe somebody else at your institution is, somebody that you want to introduce to Lustre, get them involved in development. This is a great place to start. So I'll try to remember to use this. Okay, so why should I care? So it's pretty obvious, but so if you're an administrator, so maybe you've had this problem, as I've had many times. You're working, having a great day, and then somebody says, hey, would you check out the file system? One of our users says it's slow. Okay, all right, I'll check that out. It's a hard thing to fix, even quantify, right? So with the Lustre test suites, there are some mechanisms to benchmark your system, to get performances before you load Lustre, after you load Lustre. This can help you in this fight against the file system is slow. So you can collect baseline performance. For developers, all of you guys know you're all very capable developers, but perhaps there are areas of the code that you're not as proficient in as others. So the tests can actually help point out problems, find errors with interactions, maybe with what you're developing and existing code. So it's great to test with these tests before submitting a patch. That way you know how they'll do in the review process, which I'll mention a little bit later. And for all of us, for everyone in the room, we all want a very stable and a very efficient and a high quality product. It's in our hands now, more so than ever. So we really need to devote effort, hardware, people to testing Lustre So it at the very least, stability and quality does not decrease, but hopefully improves over time and hopefully dramatically. So look, the tests are still relevant. You could say, hey, there's tests in there since the CFS days, right? I don't know if any of you remember CFS and HP running testing on the dead cluster. I certainly do. Some of the tests really date back from that time. So although some of them are old, they've evolved, they've expanded. With every new feature, they expand, and we need to continue that, and we need to do a better job at testing, and including tests of interactions between features. And if that's not enough, well, if you're a developer and you submit patches, your patch has to pass these tests. So you have to care at one point or another. Oh, and just a comment. So there are certainly issues with these test suites, some minor, some major, some that'll drive you mad, but that really doesn't matter to start getting, to start testing, to start figuring out how these things can be improved. But if you want to read about them, Nathan Ruttman did a presentation at LAD a few years back, and it's worth looking at. And just a comment, we have a presentation at the end of the slides that have links to a lot of things that we're talking about here, so you don't have to immediately Google these things right now. So let's do an overview. So what is the Lustre test suite, or what are these things? As I alluded to, these are the tests that we use to check basic functionality of Lustre and to check more than basic functionality of Lustre. These are run continuously on patches, which I'll touch on a little bit more. So what are they? The majority of them are bash scripts. And I have to disclose that up front. Many are C programs, and we have a bunch of external applications which help to set up a file system for you, run the tests automatically, clean up file systems, things like that. Also do benchmarking and performance tests. What can you do? Well, you can do a lot with these tests. You can experiment with different configurations fairly easily. That's one of the major things that Justin's going to point on, how to quickly and easily configure your Lustre file system to test features and to test different configurations. Let's go through some terminology here. So Lustre test suites. So this is everything that is in the, if you're on the server, Lustre tests RPM. If you're on the client, the Lustre client tests RPM. And also we're including the Lustre IO kit. And these, so the Lustre tests mainly have the shell scripts, and the IO kit mainly has a complementary scripts, programs, benchmarking, things like that. Test suites, you'll see things like Sanity, Comp Sanity, Sanity KRB, Sanity other things, but they're not all named Sanity. There's Comp Sanity too. These are the test suites, and they are composed of individual tests. So you'll see people talk about test suites by name, but those are composed of anywhere from just a few to several hundred individual tests that are run. In addition to this, you can combine multiple test scripts to compose a test group, and this is what's run on our patches and things like that. Coverage. This just says it tries to, and it does cover everything from unit testing, at least from a file system perspective. There are C programs to test the LL APIs, which could be expanded and will help you when you're changing the API, help you figure out that you have changed it maybe in some severe ways. Configurations, Comp Sanity, as I mentioned before. These tests try to configure your file system in strange ways, bring up OSTs before MGSs, before MDTs, what works, what doesn't, and a variety of other things. So it does this by certainly straight shell tests, straight bash, try to touch a file, trying to remove a file, things like that. But there's also, it goes much deeper. There's something called fail lock, which intentionally causes the Lustre file system to fail or to exhibit a certain behavior that you might want to test. whatever it might be, maybe dropping a packet or not doing acknowledgement, or maybe dropping a lock. You want to test for those things that Lustre actually behaves the way it should. So let's get a little more talking about the tests. So there are some things up front that you should really know. This is our disclosure. Since we're all friends here, we can talk about this. So probably the most important thing is that the individual tests, they can reformat your targets. They really think that they own your file system, the nodes. So be careful. That's just a word of warning, right? If you have data on the file system that you're testing, you may want to know a little more in depth what tests you're using and if they will actually try and delete your data for you. The test suites, they can fail due to issues outside of Lustre. This is just kind of a warning, like, if you see failures, check your system first. Is it a flaky network? Is it a node going dead? Is it a bad disk? Things like that. Documentation is lacking. No surprise, right? This is a product that's out there. So in scripts, yeah, documentation, there's usually a one-line comment about what the test will do. The tests, although they start out, usually each test suite starts out fairly simply. As the example, Sanity, it starts out by touching and removing a file, I believe. You would think that it would increase in importance or severity. They don't always, and that's kind of a hard thing to try to impose. But so just don't go with the thought that, oh, I'm running test 900. This must be the hardest, craziest thing that I can do to the file system. That's not necessarily always true. And also, you should use the latest version of the test suites, and here's why. So you might want to argue that, well, if I use a later version, it's going to test features that I don't have on my system. It should skip, if you don't have a feature, if you don't have a certain setup, it should skip that configuration or skip those tests. So always try to use the Lustre test suites. And if it doesn't work, that's a great thing to let people know, to let us know. So let me continue. So essentially, are there any special requirements to run these tests? And the answer is pretty much no. If you can set up Lustre, if you can run Lustre on your systems, then you can run the test suites. So just normal Lustre installation, whatever that might be for your site or your test bed, resolvable host names, and passwordless SSH is very nice because the tests communicate between nodes, tries to run commands on remote nodes, and you really don't want to sit there for a couple hours and type in a password every time. What software do you need? Well, we already said that you'll need some RPMs. Here's the RPMs. You really want the latest E2FS progs. PDSH is highly recommended, although you can run without that semi-painfully or hobbling. And then there's a host of other optional things, POSIX test suites, MPI, dbench, things like that. So what's the first thing that we need to do to get started? Well, the test suites make extensive use of environment variables. So there are configuration files, and there are some by default on the system. If you look under here under variables, the CFG local, this is in the Lustre/tests directory. So the local.sh file is for, in general, a single node test or single node run. It defines all the variables that you need to get up and running. The NCLI is for multiple node jobs, tests. And like I said, those are provided for you. They're good examples, and Justin's going to show you how to build on those to get started. What else? So the configuration files, it's highly recommended that the same configuration file is on each node. Tests will run, but they'll complain a lot about that. And maybe obviously, if you want to test specific features, there's usually more configuration required, but in general, it's not onerous. It's not really hard, and we're going to show you a couple examples of that. So there are some things, the variables, there are a couple things you should know about. First of all, the naming convention. There are some names that could be argued with, and that's fine. You're not going to find me arguing too strenuously against them, but sometimes there's like MDS host, MDS dev, when sometimes you might think, well, shouldn't that be MDT dev and things like that. We're going to give you examples, and we're going to point out, where things may not be intuitive. Same thing for the OSS and OSTs. Justin's going to talk a little bit more about that. As I mentioned earlier, PDSH is important. Always use the -S option. That will return the return code of the remote command and not the return of PDSH. So that's kind of nice to know. It's nice to know what the command returned, not what PDSH returned. And just comment on another variable, our clients. It is a list of hosts so that these tests can be run multi-node. So we're going to start getting more detailed here, and Justin's going to take over talking about the test harness that comes with the test suites called Auster. Justin?
Thank you. So we've gone over why these are relevant, so let's start talking about how to run them. So before we get into the configuration, we're going to demonstrate how to run the test with Auster. So Auster is the tool that drives the test. It goes through all the steps. So it'll format the file system, mount it on your clients, run the test, and then clean up, gather the logs, and generate some output and results for you. And you can use it to run an individual test, one test suite, or a group of test suites. And in the output, you might notice that some tests are always skipped. So inside individual test suites, there's a always except line. So tests that are known to be a problem or non-functional may be skipped. So that's just a word warning. So we'll start out with the very basic test using local.sh. So in fact, you don't need to do anything. This works for a single node, and we'll use loopback devices, loopback files to create a 1MDT, 2OST file system all on a single node. So the MDS, OSS, and client are all on a single node. So this is of some utility. You can run Sanity and several other test suites. Obviously this isn't a setup that's ever supported in production, and there's some memory contention between running all the services and the client on the same node. So this is just to say that if you want to experiment with testing, you can start with a single VM on your laptop right now. But local.sh is important because it defines everything that you need to run most of the test. And we're going to build on these in an additive manner. We're going to override some of the variables and then accept what local.sh has defined for the rest. So now this is an example of 3 different nodes. So kind of the simplest real-world file system that you might have. So you'll have one MDS with an MDT, one OSS with 2 OSTs and a client. So you can see that really all you need to define are the host names, the devices, and then the count. And so we're also overriding the PDSH variable here, as James talked about. But at the end, we just source local.sh. So we're just going to accept the default value for most of the options and then define what we know we want the environment to look like. And then at the bottom here, we have an example of the Auster command that you would use. So the first is the -v option, which tells Auster to be more verbose in the output. The -r flag, which tells it that it's okay to reformat these devices. So you may need to do this the first time. And then -f specifies the config name. So we're saving this config in user lib64 lustre test cfg. So Auster allows you to give just the short name without the sh, and it assumes it's in the cfg directory. So with this config, you would be running on a 3-node cluster, and this is an example of running the Sanity test suite. So with minimal additions, we can now test D&E. So we just say, okay, now we have 2 MDS and specify the host and the device. But everything else is the same. So you can see that this is actually pretty simple to get started and going. So now maybe we want to add more clients. It's basically the same thing. So we have the same OSS and MDS set up. So this is all the same. So now we just add an R clients that list the new clients that we've added. I should also say that the host that you launch Auster from is assumed to be the client that you are using in testing unless you specify our clients. So same thing, we just changed the config name and we're able to run Sanity with multiple clients and in a D&E configuration. So as James said, this basic configuration will get you through a lot of the tests, including Sanity and Conf Sanity and many of the most common ones. But there are feature-specific tests, including Sanity HSM. So in this example, everything up to this line is the same. We have a multi-node file system with 3 clients and MDS and OSS with D&E. So all we need to add is a shared directory. So some NFS mounted directory that all of the participating hosts can write to. And then we specify what the agent device is. So this is the file system that we're going to use CopyTool to archive files to. And then we tell it what host we want to be the agent. And then you can pass some flags to HSM tool. And so in this example with multiple clients, we want to source the NCLI file, which does some extra setup for more clients, but then eventually also sources local.sh. So we're still accepting basically all of the default values, and we can run a new feature now. So I talked about Auster will generate some output, and it will do individual tests and individual test suite results. So you'll see tests either passed, failed, or were skipped. So skipped is you didn't have the right utility installed, you don't have the right configuration. So the D&E test will be skipped if you don't have multiple MDT. Or if you don't have Bonnie installed, the Bonnie test will be skipped. So in, by default, it's a temp test underscore logs and then a date. There is a single results file that's formatted in YML. There's another YML for node information for each host, so the kernel, the build version, the operating system. Then each test suite will have a log, and each test case will have a log. So if a test fails, it will gather the debug information and demessage from all of the logs. And this is useful for understanding what happened during the test, and then ultimately we can use this information for triage, which we'll get to. So here's an example. I mean, this is a bit of an eye chart, but when you're looking at the slides later, you'll see that we're running this test. We're always accepting these tests. We're skipping the slow test. So Auster, unless you tell it to run the slow test, there are tests that they know take just a long time, so they don't always run unless you tell it explicitly to run them. And then here's a single result that where conf sanity test 0, single mount setup, and then here's all the steps, and then ultimately it passed, and it took 38 seconds. And here's an example where we skipped, because in the example configurations that I've used so far, the MGS, or the MGT and MDT have been combined. You can tell the configuration to have an explicit MGT, but for the purposes of showing the basics, we just have a combined one. So you might experiment and start running individual tests, and now you're ready to start running tests back to back. So in the user lib 64 Lustre tests, there's a test groups directory that contains a file called regression, which just has a bunch of tests one per line. And this is an exhaustive list of tests. This is what acceptance small is. So acceptance small file in that directory is just a wrapper around Auster that runs the regression test group. So this is pretty close to passing all 5 of the variations of what you have probably seen in getting reviews upstream. So they have split up the regression into 5 different groups because that will take many hours to run. So you've probably all gotten an email saying, what are the results of review LDISC-FS, review ZFS Part 1, ZFS Part 2, and on review D&E Part 1. So if you want to recreate that for yourself, you can run the test group regression, which is distributed with the test. This is an example of the kind of slimmed down results YML file that has just the test, the status, and the duration, and if there was a return code or any error that would be included there. So just a word about if you want to do this in discrete steps, that is also an option. So we talked about Auster will go through the complete cycle for you. It will format, mount, run the test, clean up, unmount, and do everything for you. But maybe sometimes you want to stop in the middle. So you can use LLmount and LLmount cleanup to do this in discrete steps. So LLmount will create the file system based on your configuration and leave it mounted. It stops there. Then you can run the test directly. So all of these tests can also be run just from the command line. So in this example, we're using the config name simple, running only test 0, and running sanity.sh. And when you're done, and maybe after this is run, you want to leave the file system up and explore some more. And then ultimately, you can clean up and do the last stages that Auster would do for you with LLmount cleanup, specifying the config name. So you'll probably get some test failures. So before you open a JIRA ticket, let's consider maybe your system isn't set up correctly. Maybe there is bad memory or a disk or any other number of reasons why a test may fail. So check your system components before opening JIRA tickets. So maybe we don't have a complete configuration for the test that you were trying to run. So some steps to use are in the test, or in your config, you can tell Auster or the test to use even more explicit verbosity. Or when running the test directly, you can use bash debug to see what every step being taken is. So you can potentially find if you have an undefined configuration variable that the test was expecting. Just if you're trying to get up and running, something that James and I do is run Auster, but only run a single test. So a really quick one is run Auster with sanity only 0A. So that will go through all of the steps of creating the file system and mounting it and setting up the test environment and running a single test and then cleaning up. So you can be pretty confident in your configuration if you make it that far, and it's much quicker than waiting on sanity to complete fully. Also, just a note that you really need to look at the output of Auster to decide on test failures or test success. So if you just looked at dmessage, you would see a lot of scary errors. And as James said, there's fail looks that are used to induce failure behavior. So, let the test decide if it failed. Don't just read dmessage. So we were talking a lot about the community release and testing the community release. Upstream tests are stored in a database called Maloo, and there are years of test results that you can look at. So if your tests are failing, and you're pretty confident it's not your system, it's not your configuration, and you can repeatedly cause this failure, I recommend going to look at the Maloo database and look for failures. Is this failure testing, or is this, in the upstream testing, is this test failing regularly as well? So this is just some screenshots to show that once you go to testing.hpdd.intel.com, you can click on results and then click search, and you can search for a test suite or a particular test, individual test, to see what the history of this is based on the tag that you're running. So if you're confident that it is a real failure and you have output from Auster, which includes the results and the demessage and the debug logs and the node configuration YML, you can upload this to include in your JIRA issue. Once you finally find one, you can add to it or you can create a new one. We're kind of specifically talking about the community release. If you have Lustre support, talk to your vendor first. And these results are public, so if you need permission to upload any information from sites, make sure you get that. So yeah, really we're asking you to run the regression test group on your hardware, just to check Lustre quality. Developers test early, test often, know if you're going to pass the test upstream. And for everyone, please, if you know of any reproducers, open JIRA issues so we can add those to the Lustre test suites, and just regularly run these tests. So here's our references. Most notably, there's a how-to that explains all the configuration information if you're interested on the wiki, the lustre.org wiki. And with that, I'll say thank you, and we'll take any questions if we have time.
Dumb question. Why do you name it Auster? Like after Paul Auster, the author, or?
Yeah, somebody from CFS, I guess. I don't know. I didn't name it.
I mean,
Chris Gehring, maybe? Yeah, well, ask that guy.
and when I ask him, he'll say that Gehring did? No, okay. This is a really cool presentation. What's the likelihood that you guys could actually have some sort of, and this is just the manager and me talking. I think it would be great if you had kind of an instructional video. I know that sounds like, very contrary to, my command line arguments, but, man, I'd love to be able to hire a guy off the street and say, hey, sit down, follow this video, type these commands.
Yeah, or watch this video.
I'm sorry? No.
Yeah, certainly a screencast would make some sense.
I'm not trying to question the validity of your work, nor am I trying to impugn the fine presentation that you grace us with. I'm just simply saying that seeing a step-by-step on the screen, this is what you type, this is what you get back. Justin, you left my employ. How am I going to replace you? I'm looking for guys off the street who can come in and, So if you could help bring them up to speed.
Well, I'm trying to document, James and I are trying to document everything on the wiki, so.
This is awesome, but if you give a moose a cookie, all he's going to want is a glass of milk. All right, I'm going to shut up.
Okay.
But this was great. So
Thank you.
thanks.
Yeah.
So I have a question. Is this test suite so flexible? I'm supposed to use it in a way that I set up all my network interfaces on the service nodes and everything. And can I, or should I specify it there somehow, and then this will just test my specific configuration, or this is not?
Yeah. The tests make use of we were using host names. So if your host name is tied to an interface, it will use
I
that.
have multiple interfaces and multiple nodes. So
I believe you can use NIDs as, or define NIDs for the particular host if you would rather use what the host name resolves to as the NID. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.